And so let me introduce a woman who needs no introduction. And every synonym or word that you could think of that means wise woman, activist, freedom maker, repatriation creator, anything would have Suzan's picture by it. She is someone I've looked up to all of my career and continue to do so, and am so grateful for the work that she has done in advocacy in just about every field that's important to our cultural sovereignty, those things that make us who we are as Native people, like protection of our cultural items and our ancestors, and protection of sacred places, protection of who we are, and fighting against stereotypes. And Suzan has been very much involved in working against mascots and has been successful at doing so. She's helped to return 1 million acres of indigenous lands. She has so much to give and wisdom to offer. And so I'm going to stop and I'm going to play this video so that we can all hear it. So thank you, everyone. And here we go.
That was said about the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act upon its passage was all the Indians got was the right to have funerals. Well, that is such a huge deal in Indian country that if that were true, if that were the only thing we won, that would be enough. That would have been worth all the effort. Happily, we got a lot of things in there, but that is a big one. And why is it so important? Well, because for so long, so many of our peoples led lives on the run. And we had little time for not only taking care of ourselves, the taking care of ourselves really meant escaping, hiding, not mourning, not grieving. It meant move, break camp fast, make camp fast, and make sure you get away and you've grabbed everything important, the children, the medicine pouches, medicine, whatever is important to you, make sure you have it right at hand, close by, and you know how to escape with it. So those were our lives for so long, for so many of us. And a lot of our people were not given their proper ceremony, were not given their proper burial or placed on scaffolds properly, or placed in cremation pots, those large cremation pots. A lot of our people were not able to, I'm so sorry. So if we had only gained funerals, proper ceremonies, that would have been something. It would have meant that we would have done right by each of our ancestors who were deprived of that, who were deprived of people helping them on their journey to the ancestors. helping them on their journey to the stars. All of those ancestors, all of those relatives, all of the people that we may not even know where their remains were. We have a chance, since the passage of these repatriation laws, to do something about that, to reclaim them, to give them the respect they earned and deserved with their lives. Since we always begin with condolences, and since the children in the federal Indian boarding schools and in the day schools and all the mission schools, all those people who received congressional appropriations to proselytize to us, to try to convince us or try to force us or try to torture us into being Christians and speaking English only. Those children really deserve each of us taking time to think about them and think about what it means that their graves are being found, or they themselves are listed on school records but don't exist. One of my ancestors, my mother's great aunt, my mother's grandfather's youngest sister, died at 16 at Carlisle. And she's supposedly there in the historic cemetery. I don't know that she is. She was buried after she died, and then they exhumed her along with a lot of other students because they were building an extension to the art department. So they reburied the students, and then they were dug up because a road was being built. Not a big road, just a little road around the War College there. And then they were reburied, and then they were dug up because the stadium was being built. And then they were, some of them, buried or reburied in the historic cemetery at Carlisle, which exists today. And what you see are headstones with people's names, almost always just their agency name, not their native name, not their tribal name, and the date they died. In my relative's case, they have her agency name, and then they have the year that she died, which was wrong by 5 years. So just even though they were writing it in stone, literally, they got it wrong. And there's something about just the carelessness of that is a great sadness to me. Now that cemetery is being looked at and looked into and looked through in order to repatriate some of the students. And the Arapahoes found that of the students they came for. One has a headstone there, but is not there. And no one knows where that student is. And I wonder how many are in that situation. Before any more repatriations, what I would like to see is a full accounting of where those students are. Were they actually buried? Were they actually in the order in which they were exhumed or first buried? Are they buried as in a mass grave? I'd also like to know if they're intact. Were they part of the Indian crania study? Were their bodies mined for parts by the Army Medical Museum and by the Smithsonian? Are some of those students who are missing or unaccounted for, as many were, are they among those unidentified human remains in collections in the United States that holding repositories are so eager to protect so they can use them for future studies? So I'd like to see a full accounting of the records and the people at these boarding schools. And then to do something about repatriating the people. And what often happens in this kind of situation is that those who control the grounds are those who try to obscure the facts about what has happened and to control the information so that people don't really find out the full extent of what happened. And in order to get protective coloration for that, they convince families of repatriatable children and others to urge everyone not to want so much information, not to look into this too much, not to take too much time, because that delays the time for them to be repatriated. I think we need to know if all of this is to lead to anything, and that's what truth and reconciliation is supposed to do. It's supposed to effect a great healing. But first, there has to be the truth. There have to be the facts known. And that's what we all need, I think, especially those who do suffer from intergenerational trauma. There is such a thing. We know it. It's in a lot of our families. If it's not in our own families, then we know it from other families. We've seen it. We see what happens. And we want that to be over. We want to change that. So when we talk about healing, that's part of what we want. So in the interest of offering condolence to some of these children in boarding schools who were left behind or deliberately misplaced or ill-used or malused, I want to read a poem, which I hope it's intended to be instructive about what happened to these children in these places and what they were. For people in Kansas City and Lawrence, Kansas, to think about Haskell and when the wetlands were cemented, concreted for a highway extension, what they were doing was burying a lot of kids. Because that's hallowed ground right there. That's a place they used to run to. So that's what this is about. It's connected to modern things that are happening in these places, and it speaks to holding off with any sort of development, or if you see that a federal agency is too eager for total repatriation to take place. And you get the idea that they might want to quickly use that land for something else, remind them that it's hallowed ground and it shouldn't be used for anything else except memorials. What we should be asking for and demanding is memorials for all of our children at these schools. So this poem I wrote some time ago, and it's called Children in the Meadows and Wetlands. There are children in the meadows and wetlands. Native children ran there to hide when teachers pulled and butchered their hair, when teachers stole their medicine bags, when teachers collected their moccasins, when teachers dressed them in strange clothes, when teachers beat them with boards and belts, when teachers starved them for being bad Indians, the children ran to the meadows and wetlands. There are children in the meadows and wetlands, hostages who were taken to Haskell, who never saw their families again, who never saw 9 or 11 or tomorrow, who didn't make it home for summer vacations, who couldn't stop whooping and coughing, who couldn't learn English fast enough, who wouldn't fall to their knees often enough. They ran till they fell in the meadows and wetlands. There are children in the meadows and wetlands, hostages who were taken to Chilocco, where they ran from teachers' fists and boots, where they ran from bounty hunters' cages, where they ran from high collars and hard shoes, where they ran from lye soap in their mouths, where they ran from day and night, where they ran until wolves outran them. Their teeth are in the meadows and wetlands. There are children in the meadows and wetlands, hostages who were taken to Carlisle, who got to build the school buildings, who got Christian burials without coffins, who got a mass grave with their friends, who got plowed under for a football field, who got Christian burials, who got embedded in concrete for the stadium, who got to be the practice site for the Washington Redskins because they ran to the meadows and wetlands. There are children in the meadows and wetlands. Native children ran there to hide. You can see their clothes in museums. You can see their pipe bags at the opera. You can see bands marching on their hallowed ground. You can see mascots dancing over their dead bodies. You can imagine their hair long and beautiful again, safe from teachers and scissors at last, these children in the meadows and wetlands. That poem is based on oral history in my family, on both sides of my family, and doesn't include all of the boarding schools that all my relatives went to, but it includes some of them. And things that happened are not abstract. Those are actual incidents. When I think about the long road we took from being concerned about seeing our medicines everywhere and having our relatives locked up and held as prisoners of war in these holding repositories, museums, and elsewhere. And we began doing something about it, began documenting things, began talking to people, trying to actually get to the point where we had something that would equalize our powerlessness in the situation. And that's what we achieved with the repatriation laws. Long before, we were just dealing with museums, and some of them, such as the Museum of the American Indian in New York, which was the underlying museum, had the collection that formed the basis for the National Museum of the American Indian. In 1972, my husband and I, who worked for a radio station in New York, were at, we accompanied the Haudenosaunee delegation to the Museum of the American Indian, and they were trying to recover wampum belts and wampum strings. And they knew that they were there. They had all the information that they needed and were trying to have a conversation with the director. And little did we know, the director and some staff and many of the trustees were stealing the place blind and using people and things to advance their situation in society, economically, and among their circle of thieves. And they especially prized religious objects. And they prized things that were very personal, that were one-time only, unique kinds of things like pouches with baby cords in them that aren't supposed to be in the hands of museum people or in museums at all. They're supposed to be with those families in guarded places, or with the person herself or himself, depending on the culture and the ways of particular people. So this poem is about an incident that happened at the Museum of the American Indian. And I interviewed one of the two guards that happened two, who talked, and the other one was also interviewed, but not by me. They both said the same thing. They were watching just a normal night, and then all of these things began to happen, and they observed two false face masks coming out of walking through the glass of cases that later were found not to have been disturbed since the 1930s, and this was happening in the 1970s. So this is basically what happened with them. And no one could explain it. No one could. There was a big effort to try to prove that the guards had taken the masks, or that someone had just taken them from the case. But if the cases hadn't been opened, how did they get out? There was no way to open them without there being evidence that they had been opened. So it's one of those things that was simply a mystery. And this is the way it went. And this is called the false face masks and the Indian Museum guards. The Indian Museum guards were tired. They had been on their feet for hours. This was the time after midnight to sit by the main entrance and rest. The false face masks were tired. They had been stuck behind glass for decades. This was the time between dusk and dawn to take their medicine and escape. The guards didn't look at the glass cases anymore. The mummified woman gave them the willies. The shrunken heads seemed to look at them. The baby cords in beaded turtles moved around. The faces missed the smell of burning tobacco and the songs and rattles that went with smoke. Today, someone scattered tobacco leaves underneath the case, and the faces had their first good meal in years. The guards got yelled at for the leaves on the floor. When they said no one was in the vicinity, they grumbled while sweeping the exhibit area. They noticed that someone had been smoking there. The ancestors of the guards were from Africa, and their families told them about magic things. They had not seen many Indians in the Indian Museum, but they still had seen some Indian magic things. The ancestors of the faces were Haudenosaunee visions. One was older, with more of a twist to his nose and mouth. Both were dressed with small buckskin pouches filled with medicine from their last healing dance. The faces were doctors, and they missed curing people. They worked at night and always finished by dawn. The younger one knew how to mend war wounds. The elder specialized in unexplained pain. The faces missed the society of humans in longhouses and the company of faces carved in trees in the woods. They were excited to hear the man with the tobacco say, "We need your help. It's time to come home." The faces left the museum that night without disturbing anything except the guards, who left right behind them. The exhibit cases had been closed for 30 years and showed no signs of having been opened that night. The guards said nothing moved but the masks and swore that they heard a sound like heavy rain on plastic, maybe a signal. They saw the masks float through the glass of the exhibit case and through the revolving door and disappear outside. The guards said the masks just walked out of the museum. They did not look to the left or to the right. The masks left like they were never going back. The guards swore they would not go back either. The Indian Museum never explained the incident. The guards never returned to the Indian Museum. The faces never returned to the Indian Museum. The faces in the woods at Onondaga are smiling. The best things in long histories are those that are absolutely true. And that's one of them. That is one of them. In the long history of the road to repatriation law. One thing that's happening in this time now is that the repatriation office of the Park Service is trying to sell us a bill of goods about regulations. Now, keep in mind that the repatriation laws were written as policy, and we tried very hard not to make them read like regulations or behave like regulations or inhibit behavior of Native peoples in efforts to reclaim and recover their relatives and sacred objects and cultural patrimony. Everything we wrote was for a particular reason based on the wishes and the needs of all of the people at that time in between 1965 and 67 and through 1989 and 1990 when we got the repatriation laws. So there's a lot of time spent talking about these things, why it was important to say something in a particular way, why it was important not to allow museums to gain the upper hand in this important area of law. Repatriation is human rights law, and we knew we had won once members of Congress started talking about it as human rights law and not as property law. What we saw almost immediately was the NAGPRA office and the Smithsonian Natural History Office trying to overwrite the law and underinterpret the law to give advantage to those who were trying to stop repatriation. And they would claim that this was equality for scientists, or this was something that gave everyone the right. It wasn't just a Native American law. Well, it is called, NAGPRA is Native American Repatriation Law. So that does give a little clue. It's not the scientist retirement fund. It's not the scientist collections law. It's not protection for federal bureaucrats, but that is what regulations have meant from the Park Service and from the Smithsonian. Virtually every time there has been regulatory change, it has meant underwriting the law or overriding the law to the advantage of the holding repositories, and to put the actual staff of these offices in the Smithsonian and in the Park Service in a position to regulate, to control, to stop repatriations. And it's as stark as that. I don't mean in every single instance, but that has been the main thrust of every regulatory effort. And this one, as I see, is no different. It is something that privileges and advantages the collectors, the museums, the scientists, disadvantages the Native people, and does so in the name of Native people, and pretends that it's Native people who will benefit from this kind of exercise. I do think that it's time to move all repatriation elsewhere in the Interior Department. If there's a cross-governmental part of the Interior Secretary's office that would be a good place for this, then great. If not, then the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs would be far better in this administration than any existing situation in the Park Service. The Park Service has had a long time to slow down repatriations, to not get them done, to stand in the way, to allow museums to obfuscate the law, to skirt the law, to avoid inventories, to avoid and not to do the job, to not do the job that they can do and should do and are tasked to do, which is to penalize the scofflaws. And that has never been done. I think it's been a long enough experimental time for everyone to throw in the towel on the Park Service and to say, enough, we'll take it from here. Let's put it in the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs office and let them figure out how to position it. But at least it will be where people know how to read Native American repatriation properly and how to protect graves. So that's what I think is going on today. I urge everyone to look very, very carefully at this mess that's been proposed as regulations, and to take a look at the original law. Take a look at cultural affiliation. See what the law says, and see what regulations in the past have done to alter that, to alter it, to change it, to weaken it, to strengthen the holding repositories' positions, and to weaken the Native people's positions. And then see what they would do further to build on that weakening. And don't let yourself be a part of the undoing of repatriation law in the name of improving repatriation law. If you want a law to improve, take a look at the Historic Preservation Act and start doing something about that, because talk about your paternalistic law. Tribes don't even get to designate a cultural property, a traditional cultural property, as one. They have to wait for bureaucrats to do it. Federal, state, others to decide what is their tribal cultural property, and to use words in that law like significant and important to say, well, is this the most significant? Is this the significant? Is this the important place, the important thing you want to protect? So it makes it a competition where you're negotiating with yourself first before you even get to a point where you can reclaim an area and protect an area yourself. Now, a lot of people think, oh, the people are so nice. Let's not let's look at how lovely the people are who are making these regulations. They aren't people who are going to do harm to us or try to keep us from doing repatriations. Say, well, individually, probably not. In the aggregate, however, that is what has happened over these decades since the laws were enacted. Native nations have sufficient experience with repatriations to know what needs to be changed in the law and what is just a matter of rotten personality here or there. And neither one needs a regulatory change. Things that need to be changed in the law, we ought to go forward and get really important amendments done, such as greater law enforcement provisions and stiffen the penalties for violations of the law. If holding repositories won't comply, even at this stage, with inventories, with the requirements for consultation, then we really do need to deal with it while holding a subpoena. And on consultation, And speaking of adequate and antiquated, we really have to stop trying to make consultation work. Consultation doesn't work. We have to go to a consent agreement standard. And if we can't go to a consent agreement standard, then what are we really doing? If we have a consent agreement standard, then we have the situation that we've had in NAGPRA all along, where you can't do a study without the agreement, without the consent of the people. So that is the study on human remains, the study on other things in the law. That's already consent. That's already what people are afraid is a veto. It's not a veto power. You're trying to reach an agreement. You either can reach it or you can't. The answer is yes or no. If you get to a point where you can't reach an agreement, then you cannot. Now, why do we need to go to that kind of standard? Because we've had it with all of these slow down, foot dragging efforts on behalf of the holding repositories, which really are just trying to protect what they still see as their property. So I want to share a poem with you which gives you an idea of where my disdain for collectors comes from. This is called In the Garden of the Great Collector. And I'm talking about a particular kind of several different kinds of collectors. In the garden of the great collector are wooden stakes among the cactus, single white pickets with blackened letters, Indian or Indian marker, and maybe a year starting with 18 or 19. They once were government issue for soldiers and Indian agents to drive in the ground above shallow graves. Graves of women who died at the forts, who could not fight off white men or their diseases. Graves of children who died at boarding schools, whose broken bodies finally stopped dreaming of home. Graves of men who fell in the ration line, who fed their hunger with poisoned meat. In the house of the great collector is a very large pottery vessel that once held a person who was curled up inside and covered with red and yellow ochre for the long journey to Mother Earth. Then there are the smaller pots where clothes and a doll once rested on ashes. The great collector reaches inside and invites his guests to feel his inky, oily finger. In the city of the great collector, there are back alley galleries and lurid salesmen with gold in their eyes. They call you into back rooms. They show you spare body parts. They let you touch a baby cord pouch. They roam the halls of Congress saying, over here, got any exemptions for scalp lock dolls? They open a leather case. They reach inside a money bag. They let you caress a finger bone necklace. In the school of the great collector are secret societies and old havens, the underground trafficking in dead Indians. They pass out keys to a dungeon. They light a single candle. They take an oath to someone else and someone else's blood. They open their meetings with Geronimo's skull They pledge allegiance to the cult of Indian heads. They vow to be great skull and bones leaders. In the garden of the great collector are curious guests and patrons of the arts, invited for brunch and a dig. They get a spade, they each get a bucket, they each get a glass of champagne. They all find shards and beads and bones. They all get Indian markers. They all pull up stakes and go home, the great new Indian collectors. So each one of those different types of collectors are people I have known and people I have observed and actual things that have happened that I witnessed, not even that I heard about someone else witnessing. We've had a lot of good allies before we even started using the term allies. One of them was Anne Maytag, who was the heiress to an appliance fortune. And she lived in Santa Fe in New York and was a friend to a lot of Native artists and was a person who collected contemporary Native art, modern Native art, modern starting with George Morrison. So that era of abstract modern art. And she did a lot to help people reclaim items that were going up on the auction block at Sotheby's and Christie's. And she came across one of the Zuni war gods, a wooden statue that's a living being, a definite sacred object. And it was going up on the block. And she said, something has to be done about this. And this was called A Conversation with a Rich White Lady about an auction house and a Zuni war god. My God, a Zuni war god, the appliance heiress yelled into the phone. The auction house is selling off a Zuni war god. You've got to do something about that. She was like that, enthusiastic and used to getting her way and always getting others to do something about something. You should march into that place and take that war god and dare them to stop you. Well, we have a problem, I explained. I'm not Zuni, so I can't go after it, and the Zunis can't confront the auction house. I'm not afraid of the auction house, and I don't know why the Zunis should be. The Zunis aren't afraid. They can't behave that way around a war god. Oh. Because the war god is really a person who died. And the war god was made beautiful to honor that person and to stand for the person and to guard the person until the elements claim them and they return to Mother Earth. So it's a respect thing. What if we went to the auction and said, we're returning it to the Zunis? The worst that could happen is they would send me a bill for it. The worst that could happen to you is that they would send you an invoice. The worst thing that would happen to me is they would send me to jail. Then I'd pay the cost. It's probably only $75,000. Then why don't you buy it and give it to the Zunis for Shalako? It would be a blessed message for a peaceful new year. Then the greedy auction house would get the wrong message. And what is the message you want the auction house to get? That the war god is not just art. It's not just the Zunis who care. That a rich white woman in New York cares about war gods too. On the afternoon of the auction, the appliance heiress walked into the auction and walked out with the war god. And later, she said that the auction house never sent her a bill. No, they never sent me a bill. They probably didn't want to go to court to prove how they got the war god from a Zuni person's grave. That's how, by God, they own it. We went to Shalako that December and exchanged gifts with the Zuni people. It was the first repatriated war god, and we were blessed with a gentle night snow. So Anne Maytag, good lady to remember. We need more people to be outraged on our behalf and to risk something on our behalf. Maybe she only risked an embarrassment and being sent a bill. On the other hand, look what happened. She helped uncover the fact at a very key time in the development of repatriation policy in our minds, that the last thing that the auction houses and the museums and other holding repositories wanted was a fight over title. Whether it was good title or not good title. How did you come by this? Did you come by it honestly? Did you come by it legally? If it's a person, did that person give you permission to do what you're doing with their remains? In all likelihood, not. So what happens when the museums don't want to make the fight about title? What happens is it puts you a step closer to repatriation law. And that's where we found ourselves after a few tests. It was made clear to us that they did not want to go to court on a title issue. That was enormously important information for us to have and knowledge for us to build on. Museums were constantly trying to dazzle Native people by waving paper around, saying, we have a bill of sale here. We have someone who sold this to us and we own it. Well, no, because before that, it was stolen. Before that, it could not have possibly been acquired legally. And it was through that kind of thinking and those kinds of conversations that we were able to come up with cultural affiliation and with the category of cultural patrimony, where there are certain kinds of things that they may not be sacred, they may not be funerary, but they are important to the nation itself, the native nation, in the same way that the Constitution is important to the US and that other documents like that are important. First flags, many, that's what the whole Smithsonian is built around, or the first things of importance to America. That's why there is a White House and a set of national museums. So it is with us. And we wanted to be able to say, it doesn't matter if you have a bill of sale for this kind of item, whether it's a ledger book or a wampum belt, or maybe even an area of property, of land, of real estate. And certainly seeds, certainly pollens, things that you don't need to prove whose it is, you prove the importance. You just have to declare the importance of it to the people and that it's national in importance. So that's what cultural patrimony is about. And anyone who's trying to change that, or any museum that, or other repository that's trying to tell you that you don't want to use cultural patrimony, that's not something that we would recommend for you. Try to go through the door of sacred object or funerary object. Well, they know that the test is easier under cultural patrimony than it is under the others. You don't have to jump through as many hoops. And the rewards are great because the standard is no one person or no part of the group could have alienated, could have sold, could have given away that particular person or thing because it belongs to the group as a whole. There are some really important principles in repatriation law that should not be overlooked and should not be discounted just because people who are highly credentialed and recognized in some of these repositories as the experts on your people, just because they tell you something is so doesn't mean it's so. Just because they have developed a paper for how you should proceed doesn't mean you should adopt it and follow it. I've seen some tribal repatriation procedures that are really just museum protection procedures that have clearly been gotten from a museum or another kind of repository and had the name scratched out and insert Native Nation or Indian tribe. So that's going on today, and once we, it's great to gain a law. It's great to craft a policy that does what it's supposed to do. And in the case of repatriation law, if you have lots of repatriations, great. If you don't have lots of repatriations, then regulation is not going to be a friendly or an easy way, or ultimately a wise way to go. That you should really hold out for legislative change if there's something that needs to be changed in the law. And as we know, things need to be changed in the law. But don't compound the problem by piling on more and more and more regulations that make the job of actually repatriating even harder. One thing that that we've seen over and over again with repatriations is how easily the people and things, the living beings, come into the circle and resume their situation, their position, where they left off. And that's how we welcome home our living beings. We welcome them home so that it will be as if they never left. They're taken to ceremony right away. And then the people are given finally, at long last, their rest. And a way to complete their journey. But they have to conclude the ceremonies, or they have to do certain things that will allow the people to go forward more whole than yesterday. This particular poem that I want to conclude with is about that. And it's called Welcoming Home Living Beings. Today we welcome home beloved living beings. No one alive today has seen them at home except in dreams. No one we ever met saw them at home except in dreams. Yesterday they were stolen many generations ago. Yesterday they were prisoners in private houses. Yesterday they were locked in university basements. Yesterday they were poisoned and smothered in museums. Yesterday they were branded with numbers and price tags. Yesterday they were violated by prying hands and eyes. Yesterday they were tortured and deprived of all that nourishes. Yesterday they were alone many generations ago. Today we welcome home beloved living beings. They come home to us. Their many relatives. They return after surviving a long, hard war. They never were meant to be warriors. They were created with holy purpose, as teachers and doctors and visionaries and guides, as children and parents, as artists and lovers. They were created to balance our minds, to settle the spirits, to solve difficult cases, to make a peaceful way, to make themselves beautiful. They were created by creation and loving human hands, as pots and baskets and boxes, as claws and feathers and teeth, as hides and furs and antlers, as hooves and shells and baleen, as pouches and bundles and gourds, as drums and rattles and bells, as clay and cedar and paint, as grasses and reeds and pollen. Today, we welcome home beloved living beings. We, their many relatives, have known them all our lives. We, their many relatives, have missed them all our lives. We feed their memory with sacred foods. We nourish their memory with sacred waters. We keep them in our circles. We seek them in the darkest places. We sing the song, we dance the dance they dance. We sing the songs they sing. We pray the prayers they pray. We dream the dreams they dream. Tomorrow, after we welcome home our beloved living beings, it will be as if they never left home, or us, their many relatives. It will be as if they never left home, or us. It will be as if they never left. It will be as if they never. It will be as if. It will be. It will be as if there were no yesterday. It will be tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening to the experience that I've been blessed with having. Nash.
Oh, wow. I wish we could all applaud Suzan. Let's get those emojis going out there. Thank you. So Suzan is here with us, and I want to make sure that she can hear. Suzan, if you want to unmute yourself on the line.
Yes, and I can hear you.
Yay. Okay, I'm going to hang up.
Okay, thanks.
We were working the audio in the background to make sure Suzan could hear and come on. So Suzan, I think did you want to say anything, or in response to listening and thinking some more, or would you like to go to Q&A?
Q&A, please.
All right, you got it. Okay, I'm going to bring them up on stage, and let me remind everyone to please, if you have any questions, you can type it in the Q&A, or please raise your hand, and we would be happy to bring you on stage here, either with your audio and or your video, so you can talk with Suzan. Let me show this on stage. This is a question from Michelle Pichette. Thank you for such generous sharing. Would you please share more on your thoughts about a consent agreement standard?
Well, sure. In not this past NCAI convention, but the convention before that, we did a transition document, and one item in that transition document mapped out an executive order that we want. We had hoped to get it done during transition, but you know how that is. And there's still more than 3 years to this administration, and that's plenty of time to do such an executive order. And what we want to do with that is, and it's on sacred places, to basically answer the question that was posed indirectly in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is for any state that has acquired sacred places without the free, prior, and informed consent of the people, should give it back. And that's the kind of, so an executive order would have President Biden direct the federal agencies to enter into a discovery process and let the Native peoples know. Native peoples would first identify a property, and then the people, the agencies would know that process is starting. So they would provide all the paper they have on that property. How did they acquire jurisdiction? Why is that property? Why is that sacred place, which shouldn't be their property? Why is it in their jurisdiction? How did it get to be that way? So they need to go back as far as they can to find that title. And then from there, and that will tell so much, more than anyone currently knows about the acquisition and the trading that was done from one agency to another, from one agency to a business, to an individual, and so on, and back to museums. And there's a flourishing business for collectors. So whether it's land or whether we're talking about human beings or objects. And in the case of sacred places, which would be land and water, and would involve principles of not only religious freedom, but of Native treaty rights and inherent sovereign rights, that there would be certain options. Co-management, joint stewardship, transfer of land, or other. Or they could agree that this particular thing can't be done without congressional involvement. Why? Who knows? There are lots of reasons that you might want congressional involvement. For the most part, anything could be done just with existing authority, certainly under treaties and certainly under most existing laws that you should be able to do that. So it would only be the first step, the direction to federal agencies and the reporting back by federal agencies to the White House saying, we have done this and we've reached this kind of conclusion and this kind of agreement. And then the rest of it would be one-on-one, or if it involves several Native nations, then and maybe several agencies, it would be several on several negotiations that are outside an executive order. And so it would be a process that would be carried on as nation to nation, as sovereign to sovereign. That sort of thing can and should be done under NAGPRA and under the repatriation provision of the National Museum of the American Indian Act for people and things. It should be done with the consent of the people. To have a consent agreement, you just need the consent of the people. I don't know what is so scary for non-natives about that prospect. And I guess it's because there are so many non-native people who think that any native people once in charge of anything or once controlling anything are going to be as bad to the white people as the white people have been to us. Well, that's simply not our history. That's not what history instructs. That's not what we believe. That's not our tradition. So I don't think there should be that kind of fear, although I guess that is what comes from guilt and knowing how badly we have been mistreated. That you would fear that retribution, that revenge kind of treatment back. And as I said, that's not who we are.
Thank you, Suzan. We have another person in the Q&A, and then I think we might have a raised hand from Veronica Passfield. She says, incredible presentation. As a foundational NMAI supporter, do you have insight about why it has so many sacred items in its collection still, and or any advice going into the repatriation process there?
Well, sure. The people in charge of repatriation have always been the white people. And they have been white people who still, even though they've been in charge for a while, do not understand repatriation or have, nor are they dedicated to the proposition that the law means to repatriate, that the goal is to get repatriations done, not to stand in the way of repatriating. So you have lots of unwritten regulations that are just interpretations that stand in the way of Native peoples repatriating certain kinds of things. And a lot of them are sacred objects because those are things that already have a valuation that is known, that can be known, that prices that have been placed on them for years and years and years in many cases. So it means hard cash. And I think that, where you have the non-native people in charge, and then the native people below them, kind of not supported by anyone to the extent they need to be supported if they're going to be effective advocates on our behalf. So that's a lot of it. Nonetheless, repatriations have been done, and there there are lots of good people in the repatriation office, and Terry Snowball and Jacqueline Swift and others have really taken a strong hand, and people from the board um, have worked very diligently. First, Vine Deloria and Senator Dan Inouye and Ben Nighthorse Campbell from the trustees, and Phil Deloria, current trustee, and Brenda Pipestem, a former trustee, and others who have really tried to do what they could to make repatriations go very smoothly, and to kind of be the voice of the Native people, as opposed to the repatriation voice of the non-Native person in the museum.
Thank you, Susan. I've got someone who has a mic that we're going to hand the mic to here. Her name's Shelley or Shell.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to say thank you very much for everything that you said. Something that really impacted me was what you were saying about taking our time when we are especially dealing with the residential schools. And I really felt a keen understanding of what you were saying. One of the big concerns that we have I'm on the board with the Circle Legacy Center, and then with the American Indian Society of DC. Over here, we're at Carlisle all the time. And so one of the things that gets really, that's a big concern for us, is that we feel like a lot of times there's a push to get everyone repatriated, not understanding that I don't think the Army quite gets that that doesn't mean that once the children are back with their families, that there's still going to be people who will keep coming back to Carlisle, because, as you mentioned, the children have been moved and then removed, and then some of them never were moved in the first place. There's no way that anybody's going to be able to get all of those children out of there. And we know that because the buildings are on top of them, and we know how the US government works. And then on top of that, just understanding that the buildings that are there are like living memorials to those children, and the work and the effort and everything that they put into while they were there. And so it's a living tribute to them that we take care of there. And so when you were talking about that, it had a profound impact on me. And I just wanted to say Wado, because I don't think a lot of people understand that. For those of us who spend this much time working with these children, they're not gone to us. They're very palpable and in our hearts. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that, and saying it better than I did or could. It's so important that people understand what we mean by repatriation and what we mean by proper honoring. And you can do both things. You can repatriate people. You can do your best to make sure that reclamation, restoration, all of that takes place. And at the same time, memorialize the hallowed ground. And that, I think, that's the missing piece that people have not been advocating. The Army at Carlisle, for example, has declined the opportunity to even put a plaque up about Carlisle itself. There's a tiny little plaque about Pratt and a tiny plaque about the historic cemetery, but there isn't anything about the school. There isn't anything about look at these buildings, a couple of the buildings that these kids doing slave labor made.
They have signs there that the signs drive me nuts, because they have signs on some of the buildings that say that these buildings were made by students at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, when in fact they should probably say that these buildings were made by small children ages 5 to 19 who were forced to make these, and they don't. You're right, the Hessian Powder Museum they don't tell you. They say that it's the Hessian Powder Museum. They don't tell you that that's where they put the children in solitary confinement. And you can still see, but they don't have a sign on there anywhere that tells you the little notches that the kids would put into the wall, the strike marks for each day that they were left in solitary confinement in there. It's appalling, and I agree with you, and I wish more people knew it.
You're absolutely right. And that guardhouse, on the floors of the guardhouse, which are also of stone, the same stone that make the walls, there's still blood on those stones. It's inside the stones, and that will always be there. That's, our DNA is all over Carlisle, and not only there, but every boarding school and a lot of the day schools as well. I think we need to have the country, the United States, declare all of these schools as living memorials to the families who were wrenched from each other, and the children who were wrenched from their homes and their lands, and who were sent sailing down the mainstream and tortured, and all of those things done to them. And that it's not just a matter of clearing the land. Yeah, and if you want to explain it in terms, monument terms that most of the U.S. people can understand, it's good to talk about Gettysburg or other places that are memorialized, that no one would think of just clearing the land and saying, okay, everyone's been buried for more than a century, so let's just build a highway here, or do whatever kind of development that is desired, or let's broaden the quadrangle and make a parade better able to be stretched out farther. I think a lot more thought has to go into what's done at the boarding schools, and that we on our side really need to think how that memorializing would be done. And it could be as simple as a law that declares all of them as memorials, and then you go in and do the details later. Anything that's made into a monument, not anything, but most things are done in incrementally anyway. The Sand Creek Memorial, for example, the monument was in two phases. One was the study, and the other was the actual building after the identification. So here's where NAGPRA and the protection of burial grounds and boarding schools have a human nexus, and that is, we're not talking about a burial or a student or a site. We're talking about the whole of the area, that it's all a burial ground, and it's all ground that is hallowed ground because of what happened there. Not only what was done to the children, but what they were made to do themselves, and to the ongoing impact on all our families and anyone who is a child of that knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you for that question. I'm going to bring on one more question. I think that might be all we have time for. Let's have Dawn join us. There you go, Dawn.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for all of your words. This has been an extremely impactful session, and you've had me crying more than once. I am an Indigenous woman trained as a bioarchaeologist and medical anthropologist who works for an institution. And when I took the job to work as the NAGPRA coordinator, one of the things I stated in my interview was this had to be an Indigenously led process, that the institution had to, I mean, for reasonable purposes, we had to have lawyers and administrators involved, but this needed to be led by the tribes. So our current mode of thinking is meaningful consultation has not occurred until the tribe says meaningful consultation has occurred. And I don't go in and say, you can't claim that as cultural patrimony or sacred or anything else. In fact, I've opened up our archaeological archives to tribes to go through, and we have literally gone through every single artifact for a site to make sure that we have everything, and the tribe was able to say, we want these under cultural patrimony, we want these under sacred items, and these are human remains. So like soil samples, we repatriated those back as human remains. How do we get more institutions involved in changing the paradigm of this, number one? And number two, how do we reach out to tribes who have been impacted by our improper consultation practices in the past?
Oh, those are a lot of great questions. And for those who don't understand what the importance of repatriating soil samples, when we return to Mother Earth, all of ourselves goes into Mother Earth. So you're talking about oils, you're talking about organs, brain, skin, everything returns. And so soil samples aren't just soil samples, they're part of the human being. And it's that difference between the 3x6 burial site and the entire burial ground. That's a huge difference. So what can be done? It for many of our cultures, we do, as I said in my presentation, we believe that condolences always come first. And I think that's what you have to start with, that no matter where our peoples met and how, you have to greet people in a way that acknowledges things that have happened since the last time you saw them. And that's why we're cautioned to always acknowledge the deaths, the passages that people have experienced, the grief that they may be carrying with them into this particular meeting. And so I think that's you always go back to the traditions of the people, and that's one way to start off that is time tested, a good ancient way to start off. As far as how do you reopen consultation where consultation has been inadequate, understand that those of us who truly understood repatriation did not have time to discuss it in the nuance with all of our own people before all of a sudden they were in the position of having to do repatriations and figure it out. And there's we always say that we have no precedent for reburying the person who's been held prisoner in a museum for the past century or more. And actually, we do have a precedent for disruptions, for when the river rises and bodies come to the top, and when lightning strikes a tree and bodies come from the scaffolding, and when a cave floods, or there's an earthquake and something is disturbed. So we've always had processes. We've just not looked at them as necessarily man-made. But all of those graves that were dug up and bodies exhumed and their heads taken, and they were just left there, they were put back. People understood how to do that, and you do it out of necessity. And you're lucky if you have time to do it. If there's no one chasing you, trying to kill you while you're trying to have a ceremony to settle the spirits. So I think a lot of things have to be done, and there has to be acknowledgement that, for example, a lot of our repatriations have been done by men and not by the women, who, because the men don't speak for the women's things, the women don't speak for the men's things in a lot of our cultures. And so many of the repatriations that have been concluded need to start all over again, because the women have not had an opportunity to, for the most part, to do the review of collections and to declare the need for this or that person or thing to be returned. So for all of those reasons, in addition to the foot dragging and institutionalized racism and all of those things that have worked so fully and completely in some instances against Native peoples, for all of those reasons, there needs to be more time given for a greater number of repatriations. And to for the institutions to come clean about all of the material they have that shows, that records, that documents how they disassociated funerary objects from human remains, and now are saying, oh, we couldn't possibly be able to determine cultural affiliation because most of that is done with by assessing the surrounding funerary objects, and we just don't know what they are because they were separated, as if they were separated at the time of death rather than at the time of their being stolen from the graves. So, I mean, it's really a self-serving kind of thing. But in addition to that, a lot of the institutions are hiding the very materials that that hold the answers, and they have to come clean with that. And especially the federal agencies need to come clean with that. And the federal agencies are, some of them, the most derelict in compliance with the law. And probably number one would be the Forest Service, and number one would be BLM in all places except New Mexico. And the number one would be the Park Service. And there are lots of number ones. And then there are a lot of number twos. And then there are some that really are trying to do a great job and who are approaching it as a mission and a presidential directive and a congressional directive. And who are we to stand, we the bureaucrat, to stand in the way of that? But there are just as many, and perhaps more, of the people who say, well, I'm standing in the way of that because I don't think all of this should be returned. Well, they don't get to make that decision, and something has to be done about that kind of behavior. There are already laws regarding recalcitrant employees who disobey the laws that they're hired and paid to enforce. So we just need better government and better, a more perfect law. Let's go for that.
Hallelujah.